record. Okay, tonight's class is dedicated in the memory of Bilha Bas Devorah Abraham. I got it right for once, and I remembered. Okay, we have been doing this mimer for a while now, and we got interrupted. Thank God for good things. So I want to spend a few minutes just get our bearings again, and then we will move forward. This mimer is taught by our Rebbe, and it was distributed just before the Rebbe suffered a stroke in 1992. It is based on a mimer taught by his father-in-law in 1927 or 29, which I'm forgetting now, which was the height of the communist dominance. The previous Rebbe was actually visiting Moscow at the time, and he spoke this mimer, which is a message of faith and defiance against the communist attempt to thwart and extinguish all of Jewish life. And our Rebbe taught this initially in 1981 as a message to thwart, to defy the challenge of materialistic America that was a different form of threat against Torah. So the communists tried to squash Torah, and American materialism threatened to suck the life out of Torah. And it, like every mimer, it has a framework. And our Rebbe was particular about this, just a little bit of history. The previous Rebbes, that is back to the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe who lived in the late 1700s, he died in 1812 in what was called Russia at the time, and all the way through the previous Rebbe, the sixth Rebbe, who came to the United States permanently to resettle in 1940, they would teach in a style that every week it was a continuum. Usually, of course, on Shabbos and on holidays and other special days, there would be a continuous discussion. And many of these went on essentially for a year. And they are published and known simply by the year, or sometimes years, that they were discussed. And occasionally they would cycle back to the beginning. However, they weren't designed to be a question and an answer. There wasn't the format where they began with a quote. We then sort of analyze that quote from the Torah, from the Talmud. We pick it apart. We create a series of questions that become a looking glass into a far deeper analysis. And then we sort of go off, we come up with the analysis, we re-enter that original question, and by the end of the mimer, you have a definitive answer. That wasn't always their style. In fact, there was a presumption that they just sort of tacked on the question and the answer at the end, the beginning and the end, as a way to sort of get the conversation started about the broader issues that they wish to discuss in the description of God's relationship with the Jewish people, in the description of our understanding of our own spiritual identity, et cetera, et cetera. Our Rebbe had a very different style, markedly different. His Maimarim worked in a very succinct and direct format. That is, there was a question, there was an analysis, and by the end of the mimer, you had an answer. Now, all of our Rebbe's Maimarim were elaborations. I shouldn't say all, almost all of our Rebbe's Maimarim teachings were an elaboration on one of the previous Rebbe's Maimarim, one of the previous Rebbe's teachings. So he begins with a question or a quote, then we raise some questions, and he goes, hey, well, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And then he'll quote a previous mimer from one of the previous generations, and then he'll elaborate upon it until he comes up with a definitive answer. So you have a full package. You have a question, you have discussion, and you have an answer. They call it thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, when in a cross-promotion for our discussion on the Masiras on Monday night, this is perhaps helps us understand, because the Rebbe, being the seventh Rebbe, seven is the completion of the entire cycle. That's a separate discussion. So now back into this particular mimer. The Mimer is based on a pasuk that begins in the parsha towards the end of the book of Shmos, where God says, and you is a pronoun representing Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, should instruct the Jewish people that they should bring to you olive oil crushed for the luminary. So you read that verse in the Torah, it seems to make sense. This is God relaying the commandments to Moshe for the processes of the operation of the Mishkan. One central piece is the menorah, and God is instructing Moshe to tell the Jewish people to bring the oil so that they can light the menorah. So on the surface, it seems pretty harmless. Let's move on. Not so fast, we say. Not so fast. And we start to ask a series of questions. One question we asked was, why does the verse describe it as God telling Moses that you, again, you being Moses, should command the Jewish people? Moses is not the commander of the Jewish people. Moshe is the relayer of God's commands. That is, God is the commander. Moshe is the conduit through which the command comes to the people. That's how we are accustomed to seeing it. You look all throughout Torah. God spoke to Moshe, lay more that he should then tell the Jewish people, whatever it is, the laws of the holidays, the laws of the temple service, the laws of the civil operation of society, whatever it is. Why here does God deviate from that and suggest that Moses himself is the commander of these laws? That's question one. Another question is a series. We'll just review a few. Another one is, why are they bringing this oil to Moses? Moses is not the lighter of the menorah. The lighter of the menorah is Aaron, Moses' brother. And this represents two very distinct processes by which Moses and Aaron interface with God and the Jewish people. So Aaron's going to be the one who's going to light the menorah. Why do they have to bring the oil to Moses? So it raises a few other questions. And then we say, okay, let's put the questions to the side. Let's discuss what Moses is. Let's discuss what oil is. Let's discuss what a commandment is. Let's discuss the character of this oil that has to be crushed and the relationship between Moshe and the Jewish people. Because ultimately, and this is one of the primary positions of Hasidus, it's all about our relationship with Hashem. So let's understand how this gives us an insight into that relationship with Hashem. And so we started to talk about what is the role of the Moshe people relationship. And this is not only true of Moshe historically, but there's a Moshe in every generation. And there is a Moshe within each of us. Each of us has the Moshe characteristic. This the greatest of our historical leaders, we call them the seven shepherds, and we'll talk about that, are not only people to revere and to look up to, but we say just like DNA and hair color and eye color are embedded, sorry for this lamp if it's bothering you, are embedded within a family, and we pass it on to our children and grandchildren. Similarly, the spiritual character of our ancestors is embedded within our identity and is passed on to us, each of us individually. So we describe Moshe as the trusted shepherd. Now, this is not to suggest that the Torah has to tell us that you could trust him. That seems rather obvious. And what do you mean? He's trusted in the other shepherds, Abraham, Isaac, King David. They're not trustworthy? I mean, that seems rather shallow to presume. And so we explain that what it means is not just that Moshe himself could be trusted, but that he, Moshe, embeds the characteristic of trust within the people. One of the gifts of Moshe, one of the distinctive characteristics of Moshe, is that he embedded within the Jewish people the concept of having absolute faith and trust in Hashem. Now, it doesn't mention this in the Mimer, but to give you another characteristic of it, we just, of course, on Pesach, we talk about matzah being the food of faith. Because when we left Egypt, we took nothing but unleavened bread in our packs, unrisen dough, because we trusted that Hashem would provide for us. And that's one of the reasons why Torah always refers to the holidays, the festival of matzahs. We, of course, refer to it as Pesach, which highlights how God spared us when he killed the firstborn Egyptians. God only refers to the holiday as the festival of matzahs because we had the faith to follow Hashem out into the world. Just to share a quick story, maybe add a little light on this, shed a little light on this that just occurred. So the week before Pesach, a guy from some news outlet was doing a story, I can send it to you, it's not that interesting, about how the current world circumstance is affecting the Jewish people's celebration of Passover. $5 gasoline, the war in Ukraine, etc. So one of the people that he got to interview is the Zelda's caterer, and he asked them for a rabbi or somebody who was doing a communal Seder so that she put them in touch with me. And the guy spoke with me, not a Jewish guy. And I mean, just to give you the full sense of it, he's not really all that interested. He already wrote the article in his head. And he's just looking for some quotes to support his position. So I'm trying to think, what can I say that maybe is not just the boilerplate that he's expecting. So he asked me, how is the economic situation in the world? And like I said, gas prices and supply chain, how is it affecting people's celebration of Passover? So he's looking for me to tell him that people are eating dirt and can't buy shoes for their children. So I spoke to him about the many charitable organizations in our community and about the philanthropists. Everybody is stepping up to be more charitable, to be assisting, blah, blah, blah. And then I said unto him, in my best rabbi voice, I said, this is really the message of Passover. When our ancestors left Egypt, they didn't know where they were going to get supplies. They're going out into a wilderness. There's no Jewel Osco there. There's no Costco. There's no supplies. Last night we spoke to the shliach in Hanoi, Vietnam, and I asked him, where do you get matzah? He goes, we just go to Jewel right here in Hanoi. It's a process. And he doesn't know how he's getting it. And every year it's another iffy thing. But that's what it means to go out of Mitzrayim, to go out of certainty and into uncertainty. So Moshe Rabbeinu embedded this capacity for total trust within the Jewish people. Now, the ultimate illustration of the absolute faith of a Jew that has been imparted to him through Moshe Rabbeinu culminates in the term called Masiras Nephesh. Now, Masiras Nephesh, if you sort of Google it, means the total surrender of my existence for the service of Hashem. In other words, a person who is willing to forfeit his very life rather than violate his relationship with Hashem. And it certainly conjures up the images of the great heroes of our history, Chana and her 7 sons. And again, remember that the basis of this mimer is a mimer from the previous Rebbe in 1927, in the height of communism. And we know now, probably more than they even knew at the time, about how brutal and cruel and vicious and cavalier the communists were with killing people for their observance of Torah and mitzvahs. And the previous Rebbe himself would ultimately be arrested and sentenced to death until he was released through a miracle on the 12th of Tammuz. Our Rebbe is speaking for a different type of Masiras Nephesh, not the Masiras Nephesh in 1981, although it still exists, and we should fool ourselves, but not the Masiras Nephesh of total martyrdom, of literally going to one's death. But it is the Masiras Nephesh to bypass the indulgences and opportunities of materialism to be committed to our faith in Hashem. I told the story at least 20 times about the guy I met who defended us when we were at the mitzvah tank from someone who was being rude and so forth and yelling and cursing at us. And this total stranger confronted him. But then when I asked him if he would put on tefillin, he was like, no, I can't be bothered. So there is a certain rush, and I don't mean to trivialize it, when a person feels that all of Jewish life is being threatened by the boogeyman, and that when that passes, it's hard to engender that kind of enthusiasm for overcoming my appointment at Starbucks, or opportunity to go to Red Lobster on a Friday night, or to indulge myself in materialism at any level when it dangles itself before me. Now, we then went on to describe the difference between the Masiras Nephesh, the total surrender of self at Sinai, when the Israelites said, we're in totally whatever you want, Hashem, which pales in an ironic sense to the total Masiras Nephesh that the Jewish people had for the year between the initial decree that Haman made, which occurred around Pesach time, and Haman was hung on Pesach, and the miracle of Purim almost a full year later, which is described as the validation of the commitment the Israelites made at Sinai, 1,000 years before. And we say, well, isn't that odd? At Sinai, we were at the loftiest level. We were so divinely aware. And yet we're saying that that's only the pledge, and the actualization came during the Purim time, which was like, quote unquote, the worst time, when we were threatened with annihilation. We had wandered away from our relationship with Hashem, and so on. And yet we say that that was the ultimate validation, because we didn't have the external stimuli of the revelation of God, of seeing thunder and hearing lightning, the complete reversal of our ordinary natural system. And yet we stood strong, and yet we didn't go to Haman or his successors and say, please, 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 we promise, we won't be weird anymore, just don't kill us, which metaphorically is, I won't be weird anymore, and I won't insist on my Jewish identity anymore if you'll only let me play with you and join your social surroundings and be aligned with your values. I promise I will surrender my values, if only you will allow me in to your social circles. And the fact that we didn't do that is considered a more profound validation of our commitment than the declaration of we will do even if we don't understand that we made at Sinai. So that brings us here to chapter 7. The Mimer continues. We have established that the Masiras Nephesh, this surrender, in actuality, that is, not just the conceptual pledge that I will commit myself without hold back in my devotion to Hashem, in the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs of every Jew, was during Purim, at the time that the decree of Haman hung over our heads. Because again, and this is a little bit of an innovative point that's original with the Alter Rebbe, Haman's decree states that is against the Yehudim. That's the first time we are referred to as Yehudim, which is the origin of the term Jew. Prior to that, we're always referred to as Israelites. What changed? So there's a number of things that changed. The historical change was that after King Solomon died and his son Rehoboam assumed the throne, and he was challenged by a competitor whose name was Jeroboam in English, who split the kingdom, and you've heard the 10 lost tribes. So the southern tribes that remained were dominated by the tribe of Yehuda. So even Mordechai, though he was from the tribe of Benjamin, but he was from the Yehudian section. And that's why we were called Yehudim. Concurrently, nothing is happenstance. Yehuda, the original Judah, was named because his mother Leah was being grateful, like the word Todah and Modeh, all forms of gratitude and acknowledgement. So being a Yehudi is not just being a biological descendant of Judah or being a citizen of the quadrant or the section of Judah-ish, of Judeans, but it is a character trait to be acknowledging of God. So when Haman makes his decree against Yehudim, those who acknowledge God, So this suggests that if a person would say, well, I won't acknowledge God, I promise, like I'm saying in my silly term, I won't be weird. I promise I won't do that anymore. And I'll eat pork chops if you'll just please, please, please let me play in your sandbox and let me be with the cool kids. I promise I won't be weird anymore. And I'll make more anti-Semitic jokes than you can make to show you how desirous I am of your attention. And nobody did that. Haman would have said, fine, meaning if you'll bow down to Haman and you'll surrender your identity as being Jewish, not just play along, but you'll give it up, then you're in, I'll keep you, I don't care. But nobody did that. And this was not just a one-time moment where you could hold your nose and jump off the high board into the deep end, but this lasted for an entire year. Because remember, Haman's decree comes around Pesach, and the day of this annihilation was Purim, almost a full year later, and yet nobody came to him and said, okay, we promise we won't be weird anymore. Now, the Hanukkah and Purim are like a pair. They're both rabbinic holidays. They both happen after the Torah, and we look at them to compare and contrast. So the Rebbe says, our Rebbe says, that the Masiras Nephesh of Hanukkah, when there was the decree of the Greeks, was primarily effectuated by Matisyahu and his sons. Now we know, and the Rebbe doesn't mention it here because it's very embarrassing, but in the times of Hanukkah, the battle was not just between the Greeks and the Jews, but it was also between some Jews and Jews. There were many Jews who became so infatuated with Greek culture that they became Greek, like it was with the communists. I mean, look, we know it just amongst us chickens. It was many of the communists who were most virile about uprooting Jewish life were Jews. The people who came to arrest the previous Rebbe were Jews. One named Lulav and one named Nachmanson. So the Masiras Nephesh was not of every Jew. It was those who were aligned with Matisyahu and his sons, the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees. And the Masiras Nephesh in the time of Purim was every Jew. Every Jew was there. Hanukkah wasn't that way, unfortunately. Based on this, we could explain the statement in the Maimer, again, a reference back to the previous Rebbe's original Maimer, that is taken from the Medrash. The Medrash says that Mordechai in his generation was like Moshe in his generation. Now, in every generation, there is a Moshe. One of the great blessings of the Jewish people is great leaders. We, of course, point to the Rebbe. After the Holocaust, when Jews were feeling completely dispirited, they were staring at suffering, the rise of communism, the displaced persons. Torah was not very popular. The Jews who came from Europe were seen as being backwards and strange, and they were getting in the way of all the fun stuff that was going on here in America. The threat of assimilation was looming. And into that spot, again, my bias acknowledged, comes the Rebbe, reinvigorates Jewish pride and Jewish identity. The Rebbe would march down Eastern Parkway. Today it seems so obvious, but in the 40s and 50s, this was shocking. And they would sing in their Shabbos clothing. On Rosh Hashanah, they would march the whole community. How many people was the community already? But they would go down to the Botanic Gardens to do the Tashlich service. And other Jews who lived in Crown Heights at the time, which was a secular Jewish community like West Rogers Park was in the 40s, would cower under the bed. No, look, there's going to be pogroms. And I mean, it's easy for me to mock them, but at that time, that's what they feared. And the Rebbe could reinstated this pride. Rambam came along. Again, this is one of the great blessings, is the great leadership that we have had. So that's described as the Moshe in every generation. And yet Mordechai is not just another one of them. There's something distinctive and special about Mordechai, that he is particularly highlighted as the prime example of Moshe in his generation. Mordechai specifically is not only called the Moshe of his generation, he is described as the equal of Moshe. we could say, what is the virtue of Mordechai the Yehudi, we talked about that before, is that he also instilled belief in the Jewish people that it should be revealed in their generation. So herein lies a prominent illustration of the definition of Jewish leadership. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, probably all of you have heard this, described the Rebbe as many became great leaders by persuading others to believe in them. I have the answer, follow me. The Rebbe became a great leader because he believed so deeply in us. The Rebbe is not looking for followers, he's looking for leaders. You've probably heard these expressions numerous times. Very, very profound. Now, one way to be a leader is to persuade everybody else about how smart you are. And I don't mean that facetiously. Follow me, I know where I'm going. Now, this is, of course, ripe for being taken advantage of, but some people know where they're going. There are people who are smarter than me. I mean, not me, but there are people who are smarter that we follow. Whether it's your mechanic, your accountant, your doctor, your lawyer, whatever it is, we follow them. Torah leadership, the distinctive characteristic of Torah leadership, is not how many people he can get to follow him, it's how many people he can get to become leaders themselves. How he can evoke that characteristic from within the populace. I must have shared with you before the analogy of a venture capitalist. A venture capitalist discovers a potentially powerful company with a great product that is underfunded. So he has the funds, they have the product. He infuses the funds not to change them, but so that they can reach heights they could otherwise not attain. We know that there's a lot of skepticism, it's somewhat of an American phenomena, of any leader. People get very suspicious when you talk about a Rebbe because they start to associate it with some sort of guru. What is the primary difference? The guru gets you to have fealty to him. He talks about that he is so wonderful and so smart, which he could be, and I'm not knocking it, that you should surrender what you think and follow him. The greatness of a Jewish leader, a Torah leader, Moshe, Mordechai, is how much they believe in us and they evoke that capacity within us. They talk about this in sports, that great players make the players around them play better. And that was the specific virtue of Moshe, as we talked about. And it was particularly echoed with Mordechai. And that's why he specifically is singled out as the leader who is the Moshe of his generation. Not just because he was the smartest, and not just because he was the most dramatic, because he evoked this power of faith from within the people, comparable to Moshe, the trusted shepherd, or the shepherd who instills trust, that brought this awareness to the Jewish people in his generation. As we understand that the generation of Moshe, all of his people, are called the generation who knew God. Now, when we say you know God, it doesn't mean like I know the square root of pi, or how many vice presidents we've had, or can name all the planets. When we talk about knowledge in Torah, we mean the capacity to connect what I know with what I feel and my character, not feelings in some sort of simplistic sense, but my whole character. So I could know that I should put on my seatbelt, but I don't put on my seatbelt. I could have a PhD in kindness, but I'm still nasty. That's not knowledge. When we say knowledge, we don't mean data retention. We mean an understanding, like I've used the analogy before, of reading, where it becomes intuitive. I can't look at the word without reading it because I've so shaped myself. Now, if you showed me characters in some foreign language, I wouldn't know what it meant. Similarly, if a person so trains themselves in virtuous character, when they see it, they automatically act upon it. It becomes instinctive, like the fireman who rushes into the fire as opposed to away from the fire. This is the characteristic that Moshe embedded within his entire generation. And that's why they're called the generation of knowledge, not because they had more information than us. And Mordechai did the same with his generation. But by Moshe, it was a little more obvious because he brought it to his generation. And Mordechai, what he brought to his generation was this defiant Masiras Nephesh. And again, we find no deserters. Nobody left the Jewish camp and came to Haman or Ahasuerus or any of his successors and said, again, I'm not with them. I'm not with those guys. Nobody did that. And we could say that through that we explain in the Bible what it says in the Medrash. Mordechai in his generation was the equivalent of Moshe in his generation. So here the Rebbe says something very radical. The Rebbe says the fact that the previous Rebbe quotes it means that the previous Rebbe did that himself. He himself was like that as well. He was the one who instilled the faith within his people of his generation to defy the communists at the time. Now this the Rebbe doesn't say in the Maimon, but when I say we, I mean me, project this on our Rebbe as well. That like Jonathan Sachs created leaders, what the Rebbe did gave us the capacity to believe so deeply in ourselves, to have this defined. We have these shluchim on, the guy in Hanoi, Vietnam. Well, that's nuts. And why is it that he's successful in Vietnam? Why is it that shluchim can go to these craziest of places without the most meager of basic Jewish supplies and thrive, and not just go there for some sort of novelty which wears off after a year or two, that somebody might want to do as somewhat of an adventure? Wouldn't that be interesting to live in Hanoi for a year or two or three, but make their life there, raise their children there, live their whole lives there? How do they do that? So you think, they must have some sort of special training. He has a PhD in Hanoi culture. Well, of course not. What is it? It's because the Rebbe has so embedded, as he spoke about the man we had on last night, and basically, as somebody said, everybody's story is the same story. I showed up, nobody wanted me there, and now I'm here and I have a whole community. The Rebbe is so embedded with him that this is absolutely the way it's going to be. It's not an option to leave. There's no option. This isn't just something I'm going to go and dabble in, dunk my toes in for a couple of years and let's see what happens. And it'll be a novelty and a gimmick. It is so embedded within him through the Rebbe, not because he and everyone would be the first to tell you. It's not me. It's the Rebbe so embedded it within our identity. Again, here I'm on the commercial a little bit. I mean, this guy who we had on last night, he's been there 8 years. How old is he? 35? The Rebbe passed away when he was 6 years old, 7 years old. Does he have any conscious memory of the Rebbe? The Rebbe took ill when he was 4 or 5. And yet the Rebbe has continued to inspire him as the previous Rebbe, as Mordechai and as Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, we'll stop here at the end of chapter 7. Tomorrow night, we'll do some Parsha. And,
thank you very much.
We'll see you tomorrow night. Good night, everybody. I'll send out the recording.
Thank you.